These are in listen-only mode.
Oh, hey, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining in early. We'll be starting right on time, but I just want to thank you for joining in, and we're sure looking forward to this program. My name is Johnny Lee with Peace at Work and ePanic, but we also have as our speakers Stephanie Angelo with Human Resources Essentials LLC and Bobby Fox with Copper Point. You guys want to say hello?
Hi, this is Stephanie from Human Resource Essential.
And this is Bobby Fox with the Copper Point Mutual Insurance Company.
As I know some of y'all saw from the other presentation and from the newsletters, this is really a second part. Earlier we had the chance to work with Stephanie as we spoke about this issue. I guess that was a few weeks ago. And now we're going to be talking about it much more about in terms of practical experience from doing a program implementation. Oh, golly, hey, I want to start. I see by my clock it's at the top of the hour, and I know we have a lot of things to discuss, so I might just jump right in. If we may, I just want to welcome everyone. We're going to be formally starting the discussion on domestic violence in the workplace, Part 2. So thank you. Oh, thanks, Stephanie. Some of you have been in these webinars before. Generally, we're going to be about 3/4 of an hour of speaking plus Q&A, so roughly around an hour long. While this is a training and we are going to be providing some information, we really wanted to have more of a discussion with questions and answers. We did, as you'll see, we have a number of preset questions, which might be some of your own, but then you're welcome to give your own questions. Regarding that, if you see the questions tab on your user interface, you might have to expand the little window and then you'll see the questions. Type that in, and generally we'll hold off questions till the end, but if it's something really pertinent to the, what we're talking about at the moment, we may interrupt to ask that question. Great, thank you. First of all, I want to introduce Stephanie Angelo, who I've had the pleasure of working with for a few years now. We met a number of years ago. I think it was in Rhode Island, where we did a program regarding domestic violence, and we both had a chance to speak on the subject. Through her firm, Human Resource Essential, she's been providing consultation, training, and support to organizations addressing workplace violence and particularly domestic violence in the workplace. She's worked with a lot of organizations such as the Colorado Association for Victim Services, Society of Human Resource Managers, ASIS, which is the Premier Security Association, Employee Assistance Providers Association, so along with providing services directly to clients, through business professional associations, she's been able to educate many, many folks. I know she's been recognized by some of the leaders in the field, such as Futures Without Violence. Some of you maybe remember them as Family Violence Prevention Fund. She's also worked with Arizona Peace Officers. She's received the Arizona Peace Officers Standard certification, and worked with a lot of the big names in the field of workplace violence prevention. She's done training programs with Gene Regala and Associates, if you recognize that name, and has done a lot to support people through helping keeping victims safe in the workplace. I'm sure there's more you could learn about, but please visit this website to learn more. We're also fortunate to work with Bobby J. Fox, who's the attorney for Copper Point, which used to be known as SCF Arizona. This is, well, you can read it yourself, but a very large provider for workplace compensation. And so this is really in the boots on the ground, knowing what it's like, working with clients, working with employees, addressing workers' compensation and employment law issues for a large employer. So she's done the training, she's done the policy advisement, and knowing what it's really like to be working on this issue in the workplace. She's authored or helped author the Arizona Employment Law Handbook, and she's been working with a number of those professionals in that area. She's a certified compliance and ethics professional and an associate in risk management for the American Institute of Chartered Property Casualty Underwriters. Before that, she's worked in the courts, working as a judicial court for the North Dakota Supreme Court. Wow, I didn't know that. Many associations and certifications, again, I encourage you to contact her to find out more. But I really don't want to talk anymore. I want to really pass it on to you all to begin the presentation.
Thanks so much, Johnny.
You bet.
Well, this is Stephanie, and I'm going to jump right in and get this seminar started. Let's first talk about what domestic violence spillover is at work, and go through a few definitions just to give you an overview of what we really mean by that. Because initially when I speak to people about domestic violence in the workplace, for some reason a lot of them jump to things like sexual harassment, bullying at the workplace, and while at the same time those two have a little bit of sometimes a crossover or an intersection with domestic violence at the workplace, they're really not the same thing. So when we talk about domestic violence spillover at work, what we're really referring to is, for example, the things that are happening in an individual's home life that are then affecting them at the workplace. So looking at it from a victim's perspective, it could be anything such as getting constant emails from their significant other so that significant other can annoy them at work and check up on them at work and question them. Emails, text, stalking them, staying outside of the door so that they can't enter the workplace, or preventing them from leaving home. Like as soon as the employee's trying to get into the car, that significant other or ex-significant other is standing at the car and preventing them from getting to work on time or getting to work at all. Presenteeism is a term that a lot of us use in human resources, which means that a person is physically at work, but their mind is just elsewhere and they can't concentrate, they're distracted, they're disassociated, they're just unable to think and unable to produce. If you've ever had a situation in your own life where maybe a child was really sick, or you were having to put your parents in elder care, or any number of personal things, and they just prevented you from really being able to concentrate and produce at work, that's an example of presenteeism. When you're living with domestic violence, it's like presenteeism on steroids. It can be just extremely distracting and upsetting. They might avoid coworkers and their significant others, so maybe they're not as social anymore. They might be hypervigilant, like constantly watching the clock, because when it's 5 o'clock and the workday is over, they've got to rush home because that significant other is demanding. And why did it take you 10 minutes to get here when the workplace is only 5 minutes away? Where were you? What were you doing? All of those kinds of things can be affecting them. They might increase their tardiness, as we said, absenteeism. They might need a lot of medical care, mental health use, such as the EAP, which is not a bad thing. It's just another effect of domestic violence, and we can talk a little bit more about EAP usage later on. And then the worst scenario is when the violence actually comes to the workplace. Maybe that significant comes to the workplace and actually does something destructive to that employee or to other employees. That's from the victim's perspective. For them co-workers, they might be approached by the significant other. Maybe that individual is trying to get them to help follow their ex-wife or their boyfriend or whoever it might be. They might be trying to get addresses and phone numbers, so they're annoying the co-workers. The coworker might even want to intervene and help out. Maybe they care a lot about the employee and they want to help out and get involved and ask questions, talk to them. That's not necessarily a bad thing whatsoever, but it is a spillover effect. Coworkers may occasionally be in harm's way. I mean, that's the worst case scenario, but we've all heard that it happens. And of course, there's management time as well. And sometimes management is called to task to do the things that they're not really equipped to do, such as, quote unquote, counseling the victim, which is really not what they're trained to do, but it might take management's time in order to address these issues with the employee or with the coworkers of that employee. For the offenders, they might be causing distractions at their own workplace. If they're spending time texting and emailing, maybe they're stalking the significant other by using, the company vehicle to go driving around all day to follow their significant other. There was one story I heard where an offender called his ex-wife 300 times in a day. That's an average of a phone call every 2 minutes in an 8-hour workday. That's costing their company money. It's costing the employee's company money. And they may be making threats. And again, in the worst case scenario, they actually act out those threats. We've all heard about workplace shootings. They happen. And this is something that we make it our goal to avoid with proper training. There was one case I heard about where a man went into where his ex-girlfriend worked. He doused her with gasoline, lit a match, and the effects of that was absolutely devastating. And these things happen. And so the company can also be liable for this. So when we're talking about domestic violence spillover at the workplace, that in a nutshell is really what we mean by the spillover effects. So statistically, women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence than men are. On the average, 1 in 4 women is a victim. 1 in 7 men is a victim. So I certainly want to acknowledge that men can be victims of domestic violence as well. In those statistics, 85% of victims are women and 15% of victims are men. And within those dynamics, we also have to remember that we've got the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, the whole community. So we have to acknowledge that every walk of life can potentially be a victim of domestic violence. And you can read some of the statistics here on this slide. 4.5 million physical assaults committed against women in the United States by intimate partners, and more acts of violence are committed against women by those that they're intimate with than by remote strangers whatsoever. In Arizona, there's a domestic violence call to police every 5 minutes. So I don't know what it is in your state. You might want to look that up, and that's part of what we do as well, is help you understand what's going on in your particular state. So with that in Arizona, that means about every 35 minutes there's a domestic violence call where the children are present, and the children are seeing this happen and they're exposed to it. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, is really the term that the Centers for Disease Control is using rather than domestic violence or family violence. You might hear that term IPV, or intimate partner violence, more and more these days. And it really encompasses all forms of relationship violence. And the costs exceed $8.3 billion, which include $460 million for rape, $6.2 billion for physical assault, and $460 million for stalking, $1.2 billion in the value of lost lives. And that is pretty much an annual cost. It's just incredible. And employers are not really thinking, well, this is costing me money, but when you spread that among all employers across America, it's costing you money whether you actually see it or acknowledge it or not. Bobby's going to take over the next couple of slides and really address some of the legalities that employers need to be aware of. And before she starts, I just want to mention that one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be doing this presentation with Bobby, who is with SCF Arizona, now called CopperPoint, is that several years ago Bobby called me because there were some incidences taking place at her company. And not every employer has incidences that take place, or they're not recognizing them. But Bobby wanted to be proactive and say, we see that there are things going on and let's do something about it. So we began working together, and we were able to go from 22 incidences that year, 8 of which were known to be domestic violence related, to only 1 incident the following year, and that was not even related to domestic violence. We saw turnover decrease by 3%. We can go on and on about the numbers, but having worked together, we've just been able to enjoy an incredible relationship that has gone on over the years as we continue to work together. And that is why she and I are doing this presentation for those of you that are listening on the call, so that you can take what she and I did together and apply it to your own workplace and understand the value of what implementing a total solutions package really is all about. Bobby, would you take over the next few slides?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, those statistics you went through are pretty mind-numbing, but one thing I think is clear from that, and that's that domestic violence happens. And, of course, it costs employers a lot of money. So there's lots of good humanitarian and legal reasons that implementing a program is the right thing to do. I know a lot of employers think, it can't happen here, or we've never heard of it, so it hasn't happened so far, and I think that's just really not true. One thing that we realized with working with Stephanie is that people don't report for a variety of reasons, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later in our program, but that sometimes makes employers think it doesn't happen, but it really does. And the more you educate your employees, the more you realize people will understand that they need to come forward, and it's to everybody's benefit that they do. One statistic I wanted to throw out, too, is that the National Institute on Domestic Violence did a survey of security directors, a little bit different, and 94% of the security directors ranked domestic violence as the highest security risk at work. I thought that was pretty significant. But let's talk about why employers care from a legal standpoint. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has required every employer in the country to provide a safe place to work. And states often have laws that mirror OSHA, so there's state laws as well. And I give you the section there on your screen. You could read it. That's the duty to provide a safe place to work. And if employers don't do that, they can have civil penalties and criminal penalties as well. And OSHA has interpreted this duty to include workplace violence. So if you need a reason to show your employer why they have to have address a program for domestic violence or have a policy, then this is it. Let's see, can you move the next slide, Stephanie? Thank you. Okay, so also employment laws. There's a lot of other reasons why it's a good idea from a legal standpoint and important to have a safe workplace. Let's talk about wrongful discharge a little bit and whistleblowing. Many states have laws on these things. So if an employee complains, for example, that there's an OSHA violation or it's not a safe workplace, it would be illegal to terminate them because of that complaint. And that might violate the state law on whistleblowing or wrongful discharge or even retaliation. Another example would be a worker complains that her coworker has a boyfriend that's threatened to come to work and harm his partner, and they're in the next cubicle, and she's afraid, which is natural and normal. If she complains about this, she can't be terminated for that complaint. Those are some laws that would protect her. Under a negligence theory, employers or business owners are liable because they hired somebody with violent tendencies, and then that person harmed a customer, for example, that type of thing. In a domestic violence situation, an example would be an employer was aware of the threats of an angry boyfriend or girlfriend who threatened to come to work and harm people, and then he does so, and customers get in the way, and then customers can sue the employer. And the employer has a duty to provide a safe place for customers for any harm that he knows or has a reason to know. He needs to use reasonable care. So the standard's broader than just, what they think. It's what they should know if they were using reasonable care. And that, I think, creates the duty for employers to be aware of what's going on and to take complaints of domestic violence seriously because they have a duty to protect. Of course, people injured on the property can bring an assault and battery claim in a civil suit. That's a possibility. And all of these things just create additional reasons for employers to want to protect employees and customers and their legal duty to do so. Oh, I wanted to mention work comp just quickly. Workers' compensation, as you probably know, is insurance that all employers are required to have to protect their workers if they're injured on the job. So in a domestic violence situation, for example, if a coworker is injured instead of the customer, in that situation we talked about with the angry partner coming to work, that the worker might be covered by workers' comp insurance, which would cover the injuries and the time off work, which raises the rates, of course, of work comp and takes the employee out of the workplace, and all of that costing the employer some money. But let's talk a little bit about Title VII. Now, Title VII, Civil Rights Act of 1964, is not a law you normally think of as applying to domestic violence, but it does. The EEOC recently came out with some guidance on this issue. And the EEOC, if you don't know, is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It's the federal agency that enforces Title VII and lots of other employment laws. They have signaled that they are going to allow people to file charges and to bring actions, basically, when they're victims of domestic violence for sexual assault or stalking, if it's protected under these federal laws. And so let me give you an example. If an employer terminates an employee because the employee has domestic violence situation, brought it to work, and the employer says, you know, there's just too much drama here. You know how battered women bring all this drama to work, and we don't like it. It endangers other employees, and we're going to terminate her for that. That, the EEOC says, is illegal. It is gender stereotyping under Title VII. So those are very interesting guidelines. If you're interested, you can find those at eeoc.gov. And one other example that the EEOC gives is that an employer finds out an applicant is treated for depression from a sexual assault, for example, or a domestic violence situation, and so they don't want to hire him because, you know, that's a hassle. The EEOC says that would trigger liability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA. So a lot of laws you might not think of apply actually do. And more reasons, again, for the employer to put into place this type of program. We talk a little bit about state leave laws. Now, a lot of states have victim leave laws. And I saw that Illinois just came out with one pretty comprehensive law on that too. So Arizona definitely does. What they typically do is they allow the victim of a crime to have time off. And usually it's unpaid time, but the employer can allow them to use their paid time system if they want to. And the victim can attend a trial, act as a witness, attend a juvenile hearing, or have time off to obtain an order of protection or some kind of restraining order for domestic violence or any type of assault that they're experiencing. Usually these laws also contain a no retaliation provision, so the employer has to allow the time off and cannot terminate someone for it. So those things are good to keep in mind too. FMLA might apply if a person needs medical leave time off if they're injured for a serious medical issue. That complies with that law. So that's why that's in there, just as a reminder. Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie. There we go. Okay, so I guess we're on to question for panelists. From the what are the key elements of an effective domestic violence in the workplace program? I think that's probably something for Stephanie to go first on.
Okay, well, this is really where I think the match was made in heaven between Human Resource Essential, my company, and Bobby's, which is SCF Arizona, now Copper Point Mutual, because one of the key elements, just for starters, is you have the executive buy-in for doing this. When hang on, because I'm about to lose my headset. Bobby, let me have you talk for just a moment while I plug in my headset, because I'm going to lose juice here for a second.
So when Stephanie and I started planning a program, we knew we needed a policy. That was number one. So there's a lot of things that have to go into a policy.
Okay.
Of course, the first thing you need to do...
Yes.
Yep. You got me. Okay. Sorry, I was just hearing my headset go. Do you want me to continue, Bobby, or do you want to take it?
Sure. I just mentioned the first thing to do is to put in place a policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing that we did.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I wrote a policy and Bobby reviewed it, as is going to be true of all of the clients I've worked with, because when I write the policy, I always have them have their labor and employment law attorney review it before we distribute it. Now, in the case of SCF Copper Point, of course, we have the benefit of having Bobby right there in-house, which not all of the clients that I've worked with necessarily do. The next element that we had in place was SCF CopperPoint already had an EAP, an employee assistance provider. For those of you that are not aware of what an EAP is, EAPs are typically third-party outside groups that provide therapy and counselors and so forth. Some entities actually have in-house EAP. But one thing that is extremely important in your EAP is that you vet out the therapists that are specifically trained in working with victims or specifically trained in working with offenders, and most folks don't even consider that. So if they have somebody with a domestic violence problem, they have them call the EAP, and they end up with somebody who wants to do couples counseling, which is highly explosive and truly can be dangerous. So we try to avoid that at all costs, and I'm really well connected with EAP, so I've been able to vet out the therapists that specifically work with domestic abuse. And if they don't have those folks, that we've been able to put them on their panel. But when we had those elements in place, that's when we first rolled out the management training, because managers needed to be trained on the policy. They need to be trained on the EAP and who the go-to people were. But for the go-to people within the organizations, particularly those in human resources, we did specialized training. So they went through the dynamics of abuse. They got to really understand what it was all about, learning the cues and the symptoms and how to effectively and correctly approach somebody or to receive somebody that might come forward with issues. So it's very comprehensive training, and it's a lot of fun, actually. We have a really good time. Even with something as taboo as domestic violence, we have a lot of fun. We can roll in some security measures, and then after those things are all in place, that's when we do the staff training, because everything else has to be done and correctly in place and ready to go before you do domestic violence training and awareness and kind of like an advocacy type of domestic violence training for the employees. And really with that, what we benefit from all of these elements being put in place is to have a complete culture change in the organization. We then create an organization that says we're not going to condone it, we're not going to help those people that are perpetrating it, and we will be here as a support system for those that may be suffering from the effects of domestic violence.
A couple things I'll just add there. Okay, a couple things I'll just add there, Stephanie, is things to include in your policy. The policy is not as simple as you probably think or would hope, because you have to remember a few things specific to domestic violence. One thing I think is non-retaliation. We talked about that, but I know people are sometimes afraid to come forward, and they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. So having a non-retaliation statement in your policy for people who make a good faith report is crucial. I think also stating that your employees have an obligation to report signs of workplace violence and domestic violence is also crucial, because everybody should know that it's a workplace issue. It's not a private issue for that person, but it involves work. So that's really part of the education process I know you were talking about for employees. Also, reporting if an employee has a restraining order or an injunction, reporting that to HR or security is also crucial, because the employer needs to know. They need to be able to take steps to take whatever protective measures they need to, but oftentimes you can get a restraining order or an injunction and the employer doesn't have a clue that that's in place. Sometimes an employer can get one on their own, and that's helpful. Some state laws allow that. And then also, I think if you are able to, like Stephanie mentioned, communicate to employees that there's local domestic violence shelters and resources available and an EAP, so that when they do come forward, there's definitely resources already vetted and already in place. And that's been extremely helpful in our program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, what we're able to do is not only do we have it in the policy, and I know we're going to talk about policies a little bit more in a couple minutes, but yeah, when we work together, or any of the clients that I work with, not only do they get it in a hard copy, like an actual binder that the managers get, but we have soft copy so that any part of that people need, we can email anywhere within the organization. And we do update it, because like here in Arizona, we had a change in our domestic violence law about 3 years ago, so of course we had to make some changes to the policy. Johnny, I didn't know if, were you going to moderate these, or do you want Bobby and I just to roll with this? Oh, I don't hear Johnny right now.
You know, you couldn't hear me before. I had my microphone muted. My mistake. I always forget that it's muted. It sounds like you're doing a great job with the roll, so please, if you'd like to keep talking, I'd be glad to do it if you'd like, but you're doing a great job.
Oh, okay. So this one, what are the challenges in rolling out a domestic violence in the workplace program in an organization? How do you overcome them? Well, I'm going to let Bobby talk about this a little bit more because she's actually in the workplace. For me as a consultant, probably the only things that I run into most frequently are those organizations where they're in denial. Like I told you, the most effective thing in the previous thing was the fact that the executives of SCF Copper Point really had buy-in, and so like water flowing downwards, when they were really emotionally enrolled in having a program, everybody felt it. But sometimes there are organizations where they just, oh, it's taboo, it's a personal issue, we don't want to deal with that. And that could be a real challenge from my perspective. So that's probably the hardest thing that I deal with, but I'd like to have Bobby talk about this one a little bit more.
I do agree with you in that one of the biggest challenges is in educating employees and management. I know from a management standpoint, managers, they want to help. And where you educate managers, you know, you educate them that they can't go to their house and help them move to a shelter or do something like that. That's inappropriate. There's certain things they can do, certain things that they can't do. And that's a tough piece for people to learn and understand when they have to step away. For employees, every employee, I think, has some sort of sense of uncomfortableness with this topic. And I think it's just that creates a huge challenge in communicating and getting people to understand it's okay to talk about. One way that we have done it is in the training, but also in posters, and we have resources in the bathrooms and in the lobby areas and talking about domestic violence. So once you see that over and over, I think people get more used to it. It becomes a little bit less uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Uh-oh. Oh, wait. One moment. I'll get the screen to move.
Okay.
There we go.
Great.
Why is it recommended to have a domestic violence in the workplace policy and not just language incorporated in workplace violence, unlawful harassment, or other existing policies? Well, it's like Bobby referred to earlier. You know, a separate policy is important because it has undisputed different language in it that specifically address the distinction between domestic violence and workplace violence, or unlawful harassment, or as I said at the very beginning, bullying, things like that. It is absolutely a different animal. And so with the policies that I write for organizations, we cover so many different elements. Like Bobby was referring to, we talk about the roles and responsibilities of managers, roles and responsibilities of employees, of offenders, what the consequences might be. We talk about legal resources. We talk about safety and security resources. There are just so many different elements, and at the end of the day, what you really want is something that's going to limit your liability, because if for some reason you do end up sitting in front of a judge and a jury one day, what do you hope that you have? You're going to hope that you have a really, really comprehensive policy that covered everything that you needed to, as opposed to 3 little sentences buried inside your workplace violence policy.
Yeah, I agree. And you want to do 2 things. You want to limit your liability, and you want to do the right thing for your employees, because not only is it the right thing to do, but it also eliminates liability and creates a better working environment, which makes your employees more productive. No one can be productive when they're afraid at work. So yeah, having a separate policy is important because domestic violence, like Stephanie indicated, is a unique issue. It's unique for the perpetrator and the victim, and you can address both of those in your policy and provide resources to both of those. That's totally unique from any other of these other policies. And of course, it does create that additional awareness that's important.
Agreed. Definitely agreed.
Oh, just to let you know, someone's been asking questions about this very specific thing, so I know it's of interest to the audience.
So is that something that you want to address at the end then? We'll make sure we get to that person's question, or right now?
Oh, it's the same. You answered it. They were asking about a separate DV policy.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
good. I'm so glad we answered it. And then both Bobby and I are available, of course, if there's follow-up question and so forth.
Great.
Okay. So this next one, sometimes a victim returns to the abuser. How would you recommend that management respond? If an employee was able to... Well, that's interesting. You know, we cannot dictate what that victim is going to do, and part of the trainings in and of themselves really address some of the dynamics of abusive relationships. I have a separate program, for example, called 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover and Other Myths About Domestic Violence that really covers 5 different areas in somebody's life that may propel them to have to go back to the abusive relationship. And we really kind of dissect and talk about these so that we really gain a clear understanding of what can happen in abusive relationships. So having said that, you really can't dictate what they're going to do, and it can be frustrating for employers. I get that. I talk to a lot of people at shelters that find it extremely frustrating. But unless they're violating a policy that has been communicated and discussed with them and known to them, I wouldn't suggest that there's really a lot that you can do. That's going to be a little bit different when we talk about things that they're doing off the job that could be actually harmful to the workplace. And I think that there's a slide later on where we talk about offenders doing that. But I think that management should do the same thing that I tell families to do, because I've talked to parents that say, well, I'm going to kick my daughter out of the house and she just can't come back here. That is absolutely the last thing you want to do. You need to make sure that you are there and you are available and that you will reserve judgment, because the very thing that provides emotional and mental ammunition for an offender is when they can have their significant other, the victim, alienated from any possible resources for support, and a large part of that is the workplace. So if you say, well, you've gone back to your significant other and we will no longer be here to help you, you're just making that person's job, the offender's job, that much easier. You're putty in that offender's hand. So stay there for the employee. Tell them that you will not judge them. When they're ready, you are there for them and you will provide help and assistance. That would be my suggestion.
This is a very tough question. What happens when they go back? What can you do as management when they violate a restraining order? Really tough to understand from a management perspective, but I agree with Stephanie that you can discipline your employee if they're violating their restraining order or a policy, but you'll have to ask yourself what's an effective means of dealing with that. Probably discipline's not going to have the impact that you want it to have. You want him or her to stop doing that and to accept the resources and support that you're offering. And so probably the better path to getting that to happen would be offering the resources and discussing it and providing EAP and all those things that we've talked about.
And just a very quick thing on that note is that on an average, a victim will call a shelter 9 times before actually going to one, and typically it's because they don't feel ready, they don't feel safe, they don't feel secure, and they need to test the waters by asking questions. So if it takes 9 times on average to go to a shelter, just imagine the same thing is really happening at your workplace. So you can almost expect that they're going to go back a few times. It's scary and it can be dangerous because these situations undoubtedly escalate, and I understand that. Believe me, I get that. So stay there as a support system for your employee. Next question, in your opinion, who should make decisions based on workplace safety, security, or HR? Many times they have different views. This is true, and this is going to come out of your workplace training and the policies and procedures you set forth at your workplace. But the question in front of us says workplace safety. And so with that being the question, I would say it's probably going to be security. Because we're not talking about policy and procedure administration, we're talking about safety. So if I'm talking about avoiding a gun battle at the workplace and things of that nature, and people coming onto the work site, getting past security and getting through our doorways and all of that, then I would say it was probably going to be the security department.
Yeah, that's a good point. If, on the other hand, it was more of a threat at the workplace and you needed more information on what to do about that threat, which is often the case, it's probably better for security and HR to work together. And that's part of the process that we have, is we alert security. They do a security assessment of the threat. They give us their opinion, and HR and the threat response team that we have in place takes a look at it and decides what the next step should be. And along those lines, the threat response team, the best team to put in place if you have these resources at your company would be HR, legal, or outside legal, security, of course, if you're lucky enough to have security, a risk manager, and possibly facilities if they know the building and you need some access restricted or that sort of thing. And that team will help you put a process into place and decide the who, what, where, why of it all. And of course, while you're doing this, make sure you document it. That's the attorney, of course, speaking, so that if something happens, you can justify what you did and why.
Next one is an employee refuses to acknowledge that she is in a DV situation. The abuser has threatened her manager. What action do you recommend to protect her coworkers and prevent the abuser from coming into the workplace? Well, most employees are going to refuse to acknowledge that they're in a DV situation because victims don't see themselves as victims. They don't apply that label. Very few of them really understand what it is that's happening to them. At SCF, Copperpoint, for example, they took my book, Bringing the Darkness into the Light, and they sprinkled copies of that book all over the workplace and just sort of watched them disappear, because in that book itself it has so many stories from people and resources that by osmosis people would say, oh my gosh, that sounds just like me. I didn't even realize I was actually a victim. And this is also what the training does, is by osmosis people hear the indicators of domestic violence and they realize, oh my gosh, that's me, which is why it is so important to have mandatory training, not optional, because then you get everybody in the group, you take away the taboo, and then those that need to hear it are hearing it. Because otherwise people think that if they go to an optional training that they have some sort of neon sign that says, I'm a victim. So getting back to the question at hand, there are lots of things that you can do. You can provide security to walk them out to and from their car. You can change their outgoing voicemail so that it's still them, but actually have the employee working at a different phone number. So everybody else has that new phone number, but the significant other does not. You can change their hours or their shift a little bit, so long as you don't harm them in any adverse action in terms of their actual job. You can transfer them. You can provide like a split shift or any number of things like that, so that you can make it not as easy for the abuser to get to them while still maintaining that person's job. So the bottom part of this says we relocated her to another facility and we would like her to obtain a restraining order and list our business on that order. We've taken measures to protect the building, but she refuses to cooperate and denies she's abused. What action do you recommend? One of the things that can be in the policy is a requirement that if certain conditions are not met, for example, a minimum of 3 visits to the EAP, that person might be suspended or something. Now, this is not an adverse action in the fact that they are currently violating a policy. So in order to maintain that person's job and not have them terminated based on corrective action, you could say you've got to go to the EAP for 3 times. We have recommendations that you call this particular person who is trained in your type of situation. We don't need to know what's going on. We are not privy to your conversations, but they will report at least the utilization that is something that you can do, but that has to be an element in your policy. So that could be one of the things that you could do to address that situation. Bobby probably has some additional things to add to this as well.
Yeah, you made a lot of great points there. I think one of the points that you're making is that as an employer, you need to address the situation whether the employee acknowledges that she's a victim or not. That from an employer perspective, that's not so crucial. What you need to address is the threat, implement your process, get an injunction if you need to, alert security, and do all those things to keep your employees safe, regardless of what the victim acknowledges or not. You still use your process. So that's one of the points I think you're making. And then you talked about training, and sure enough, I know that we've both experienced that when you do provide training, people do recognize themselves or someone that they know or a coworker, and after every single training, somebody comes forward and they want to talk about that. I recognize myself, I recognize my coworker, I'm worried about this, or this happened at my last job. It triggers things, and that's always a really great thing for awareness and understanding of your program.
It is, and one of the beautiful things that comes out of that is the number of people that come forward and they seek help, even if they contact, like they've contacted me separately and privately, and with my relationship with Bobby, she's been perfectly comfortable if people contact me directly rather than go to human resources, which is a great way to utilize the services of having an outside subject matter expert, is that management doesn't have to take the time away from other duties, particularly pertaining to Copper Point Mutual, by having somebody that their employees can go to. That's really a great thing. This question says, often the victim is reluctant to come forward and ask her employer for help. What are the best ways to address the barriers to reporting and disclosure? Well, I guess we kind of talked about that in the last slide. Really doing away with the taboo and saying, yeah, we really do understand this is a very difficult and emotionally charged subject. We're talking about potentially changing your relationship and everything to do with it. We're talking about potentially uprooting children and separating them from parents. We're talking about a whole lot of difficult issues here. But that's why we're here to help you. And so really creating an atmosphere that makes it safe and supportive for people, I think in and of itself is going to break down a lot of the barriers to people coming forward. And like Bobby said earlier, telling them that there is no retaliation. We will not do that here, and we will welcome you coming forward and reaching out for help. That in and of itself just creates an environment where people feel safe, because they won't, unless they feel emotionally and physically safe, they will not come forward, because they're going to be so worried about possible retaliation and possible consequences, not only from their significant other, but from the workplace too, that they're going to protect themselves. So when you knock down all of those walls, you will have people that can climb over them and come to you for help.
Yep, that's
Great.
good. And I think we talked about that in most part. I don't have a whole lot to add other than the education, creating the atmosphere where it's okay. You talked about the books and the posters and the other information all over that you make it okay to talk about. And that's really key here.
So this question says, how do you address employees' fears when a coworker is stalked or threatened by an abuser? Having a really good security process in place will help, and letting them know that security is trained for this type of situation and is doing everything possible. We've alerted the outside resources, for example, police. We have police maybe coming and checking at the workplace. We have security walking around. We have procedures in place where we have only one entrance and exit to the entire building. Everybody has to stop at the front door. Everybody must sign in. Everybody must have their briefcase or backpack or whatever inspected. All of those kinds of things that you can put in place are going to really ease your coworkers' fears when there's a fellow employee being stalked. Because the last thing you want to do is just go ahead and fire that employee that's already being stalked and victimized because of coworker fears. I've seen a number of lawsuits as a result of this, and it's the company that pays the price. So I will strongly suggest that is the last thing you do. So really have your security and measures in place, and there are resources there to help you, and we can talk you through the processes that we did with SCF and CopperPoint and other clients the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of it, like you said, it's normal to feel fear for this kind of thing, and the risk is real a lot of times, and so it's healthy to feel that fear, but HR can help with acknowledging this and letting them know that these are the steps we're taking and taking additional steps to address that risk, which, like you said, is key in minimizing any liability should something happen. On the second part of that question, they talk about how should HR respond if a coworker refuses to come to work while the victim is in the workplace. That's a tough one too. So if a worker's fear gets so strong that they won't come to work anymore because of it, I guess the things that you can do from an HR perspective is to, again, help with that fear, refer them to an EAP or some type of counseling, allow that time off as long as you can or as long as they have the time off, all lending toward the culture of it's okay, we know this is happening, we're addressing it, and these things, the domestic violence is real.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Thanks. This question, if an abuser has no job performance, misconduct, or criminal charges, but the employer knows about the abuse through the victim disclosure or civil injunction or order, can or should an employer take any actions? I've talked to other attorneys, including, I think, Bobby, you and I may have talked about this before, but the abuser can be disciplined for off-duty behaviors if it reflects poorly on the company, or if there's a policy in place about things that are contrary to, I'm probably not using the right term here, but what's publicly acceptable, and abusing your significant other and so forth is not publicly acceptable behavior. We certainly don't think so, and we're certainly not going to condone it. And so there have been cases where an abuser has been disciplined even though on the job their performance is not being affected, or the employer hasn't seen any indication of it. But the likelihood that their on-the-job performance is affected somewhat is probably still pretty likely.
Yeah, it's a tough question. Most employers don't want to go there probably. Some, depending on the nature of the employer, can't under certain laws too. But I think from an HR perspective, if you know about it, you can't really unring that bell. If you know about it, other people probably know about it in the workplace. And one of the things you can do is offer that perpetrator resources, resources that you put into your program for abusers. So that would be helpful, hopefully, and hopefully they'd accept those in the best case scenario.
Mm-hmm. How can we address the public perception about having a domestic violence for their workplace? How do we address the stigma that surrounds this issue? I would suggest you do it head on. You say, you know what, you're right. There is a stigma around this issue. There is a taboo, and that is exactly why we're going to address it. Because if we keep skirting around the issue and putting blinders on and pretending it doesn't exist, we will never resolve it, and that's why it continues on and on and on, generation to generation and generation. But we as a company are going to address this, and I think that having that acceptance and that willingness to move forward and address it as a stigma, and to eliminate that whole persona about having it be such a taboo issue, is what I meant earlier when I talked about getting the executive buy-in, which then has a wonderful effect on the management and then a wonderful spillover effect onto the employees as well. Just address it head on and look at it for exactly what it is.
One of the benefits, so maybe a side benefit of the manager training and employee training, is that employees get the sense that management cares about them. They care what happens in their life and that they're safe at work. And I think employees really appreciate that and will start to embrace your program that way.
Okay. How can an employer quantify or demonstrate the benefits of implementing a domestic violence program in the workplace? Well, when we talk about quantifications, one of the things that I created years ago was a series of mathematical formulas where I can look at 11 different line items of the organization and calculate really what domestic violence is costing that organization based on these 11 different line items. And so what we see as a beautiful effect afterwards is how much we actually saved. I talked earlier about turnover statistics with SCF Copperpoint. That was a significant amount of money that we could actually figure in to a savings on the bottom line. And so those kinds of calculations really help us say, you know, we put this program in place and here's how it paid for itself 10 times over. And it does that year after year after year. So if you're really worried about quantifying it, that would be the way I would suggest doing it.
Yeah, and HR departments probably typically calculate what does it cost us a year in absenteeism. If you can calculate the average time lost from a domestic violence situation, calculate that absentee cost, the cost if somebody quits, the cost to replace that employee, the cost if they're not productive. All of those things are definitely bottom line costs. The other thing, preventing a claim or an issue by taking this domestic violence program and processes and putting it into place and training, that'll prevent claims and prevent reputation damage costs, which I know executives would be extremely sensitive to. Damaging this public image would be a cost that's really hard to quantify, but it's another thing that this program will definitely prevent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Okay. What are the benefits of implementing a domestic violence program for your workplace? Well, I have a tagline that is creating a workplace that is safe, supportive, and sought after. So we really kind of address the safe and supportive aspect, but the sought after aspect really relates in large part to what Bobby was just saying. When you look at something that's gone south for an organization, the public perception of your company is really disfavorable. But when you are a company that really addresses things head on, and the greater community sees that, they see it in what people are saying about your company, they see it in what employees are saying, they see what's in the newspapers and on TV about the wonderful things that this organization has decided to become involved with, even, for example, with SCF Copperpoint. As a result of our working together, they chose a Sojourner Center as being their domestic violence shelter of choice in order to do fundraisers for, and they would collect clothing and household goods for donations, and it was just a wonderful thing. So it's been a real beautiful cycle. And so that's what I mean by the third element, which is making your organization sought after, because I don't think SCF is ever hurting for people to want to work there, because they are such an employee-centric organization, and it's just a really, really wonderful thing to see.
Oh, thank you. I know we appreciate those comments. Yeah, having proactive strategies that we're talking about, putting your processes in place before something happens, that helps you avoid anything costly, incidents, and any liability, and it provides most importantly, I think, your employees with the confidence that they're safe at work and that they can be there and be productive and do their job.
Good. Well, we know we only have a few more minutes left,
Yes.
so I think, Johnny, did you want to open it up to Q&A? Or?
Certainly, and you're right. I know you answered many of the questions that folks have been asking all along, but there's just a couple, if we got just a few minutes to answer them.
I'm willing to stay on, sure. And Bobby, I think, can
Sure,
you?
yeah.
Great.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
An early on question was, can employers terminate an employee for not alerting them of a protection order?
I'll go ahead and take that first real quickly. Again, policy, policy, policy. If it's not in writing, it probably doesn't really exist. And so if it's not in writing, I would be extremely cautious of doing something like that. But if the employee has an order of protection or injunction against harassment, which in the state of Arizona there's a distinction between the two. Every state does differ though. If the company is named in it, then the policies should say that if a company is named in it, then the company must be alerted to the fact that it is named and that the employee has taken out an order of protection. One of the situations I was interviewed for was a case in Indiana where Pitney Bowes terminated a woman because she came forward and she said, I have an order of protection and I've named the company. They fired her. She ended up suing them and she won. So I would be very cautious about anything of that nature depending on the language of your policy.
Right. I mean, that's the perfect answer. Definitely you'd be in a position of defending your decision to terminate and trying to explain why you did it and why it wasn't retaliation or why it wasn't discrimination and all that. And it's a tough claim. Definitely, I would say have that in your policy. Make sure your employees report every restraining order or injunction that they have to HR so you can take action on it. And then you can discipline on it, but probably the better approach is just to educate.
Absolutely. What are the thoughts? You sort of addressed this about the accusation about an abuser employee, but the question is about victims and abusers working together. Let's say there's no criminal charges or restraining orders, but if it's generally known that there's an accusation of abuse, any challenges or issues around both of them employees?
When you say that the abuser is employee, you mean the abuser to that victim?
Correct, right.
Okay.
The relationships, both of them are employees.
And there's no order of protection trying to separate the two of them at the workplace, anything of that nature? You know, I would say if that's the circumstances, then EAP, EAP, EAP.
Right.
You know, you lead them to the resources and you strongly suggest that they use them if it is affecting the workplace and their work, and you have policy to support that. Without the policy to support that, you're going to be saying, which I hope you will in all cases, we care a lot about you and we know that you're dealing with some things in your personal life. We do have some resources. Here are some phone numbers. We want to give you every opportunity to call them, you know, and just offer them those things. But you can't really have any kind of consequences if it's not actually affecting the workplace or if you don't have any policies to support it.
The only thing I would add to that is if there are things going on at work that you need to address that are, you know, disruptions at work or confrontations at work, or and if it's affecting the coworkers in ways that would violate policy, or the work time is being used inappropriately, then you can address those issues separately as work issues, and that might send a message as well.
Wonderful. Say, I know we're a little after. There's a few more questions, and I thought if people will know how to reach you, they could always contact you directly for further, or I can keep. Oh, thank you very much. If I may, folks, if you could screen capture that or write down those email addresses and ways to reach people, I think that's a great way to communicate. But I do recognize that people need to get on and you know, get back to other meetings and things like that. Stephanie and Bobby, I want to thank you so much for this. I know I learned quite a bit, even though you know, we and I have worked together before. We had the other discussion. Again, made me think of more questions, and I think we could easily have gone on another hour.
Yeah, it's always so fun and so energizing to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
I just personally want to thank Stephanie for doing the work that you do in terms of getting the word out and educating so many folks, and then Bobby for you to actually, you know, make it happen at your workplace. That's really the one thing I just want to put out a pitch here for that. I think one of the most important parts of any policy is a champion, like someone who cares about the issue and keeps it on the meeting agendas, and that's what you all do, and that's really key to making change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Great.
And thank you, Johnny, for putting this together, for the invitation, and I just want to thank all of the folks that just tuned in today to the conversation. It's been nice talking with you, and so certainly send emails or follow us on Twitter and Facebook and all of the other social networks out there.
Excellent.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I'll get in touch with you all, but everyone else, just thank you. I'm sorry, were there any other final thoughts or words you want to say?
No, I think I'm good. I just want to thank you and thank everybody online, and they can reach us afterwards if they want to.
That sounds great.
Yeah, we'd welcome it.
Great.
Me too.
Super. Stay safe, everyone. Stay tuned for other programs, and I look forward to continuing to doing these webinars. So, all right, take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.